We're currently working to submit our paper to a journal, which means that any thoughts or comments you might have are, of course, very welcome. In our paper, we respond to a methodological approach to studying the effects of leave policy for fathers on variables like the gender, the division of labor, and gender equality, but especially on fertility rates, where both researchers and academics might be particularly interested in causal effects of policies. And we argue that researchers in this field who build on the microeconomic tradition and are interested in the idea of policy transferability might be tempted to study leave policies for fathers by focusing, on the one hand, on causality or identifying causal effects of these policies, and on the other hand, on what is best practice policy, or identifying what kind of policy can be expected to have such causal effects. And what we do is we problematize such approaches based on feminist theoretical interventions. We argue that an overemphasis on causality and best practice can lead to misunderstanding the effects of policy. Our study has been motivated by the case of the Slovak leave policy for fathers, or the Slovak daddy quota, which is unique in a couple of ways pertinent to our paper. First of all, the policy was introduced in an apparently exogenous manner, which might appeal to researchers interested in studying the causal effect of policy by way of a natural experiment. So parliamentary transcripts of debates leading up to the adoption of this policy suggest that it was originally intended only for adoptive fathers to facilitate their time with their newly adopted children. A similar policy was debated for adoptive mothers at the same time. However, ultimately, the policy was formulated in a way and came into effect in a way that applies not only to adoptive fathers, but to all fathers who have a track record of insurance contribution. Crucially, it is our understanding that this development, so the switch from adoptive to all fathers, was unplanned and unexpected, and perhaps a matter of creative policy implementation rather than intention on the part of policymakers. This unexpected manner of introduction means that in relation to the general population of fathers, the policy was implemented exogenously without prior public debate or lobbying. And this exogeneity is the first reason why the Slovak daddy quota stands out. In most countries, policy reform is generally preceded by public debates and so is anticipated. Consequently, when it is passed, it is considered endogenous. This means that in most countries, families may strategically plan around such anticipated policy change. They can either postpone the start of the father's leave to coincide with a new policy regime, or perhaps even postpone the time of conception and birth of their child, or at least try. And the possibility of such strategic planning interferes with studying the causal effect of such endogenous policy. In Slovakia, due to the exogeneity of the daddy quota, such strategic postponement was not possible, which could tempt researchers to try to make use of this unique case to isolate the causal effect of this policy. A second reason why the Slovak policy might attract the attention of researchers interested in policy transferability are the best practice characteristics. And I think I'm going to stop with the air quotes on best practice from now, but please, every time I mention best practice, consider it air quoted. or scare quoted rather. So the policy grants fathers 6 months of well-remunerated, non-transferable benefits. And this combination of length and high remuneration make it one of the most generous, if not the most generous policy of its kind globally. Generally recognized leaders in terms of egalitarian leave policy for fathers, like Iceland or Sweden, offer fathers less generous policy entitlement. And these best practice characteristics come up frequently in literature on fathers' leave taking. They're very explicit in non academic literature, maybe a bit more implicit in academic literature. However, along with these laudable features, the Slovak policy also stands out for another characteristic. Which is this one. According to a prominent interpretation of the legislation, fathers are allowed to continue with paid work while drawing on leave benefits. And they can do that if they are self-employed or working based on a new contract. So either when they switch to a new company or to a new position with their previous employer. In other words, fathers can draw on the new daddy quota without actually taking breaks from paid work. This may sound a bit confusing, but similar to extending benefits to all fathers as opposed to adoptive fathers only, we believe that this paid work while on benefits option was unintentional. And in another paper that forms my thesis, I analyzed the discourse associated with this policy and found that proponents of this interpretation have emphasized the new policy as a means to increase family income rather than a way to motivate fathers to actually look after their children. So this would be more in line with this option to actually stay in paid work while drawing on these benefits. So on the one hand, we have these best practice characteristics of the Slovak daddy quota that mean that the policy may have a considerable effect on parents' gender division of labor or fertility rates and so on. On the other hand, we suggest that this paid work while on benefits option may considerably moderate the effectiveness of the Slovak policy despite the best practice characteristics. At the same time, the Slovak daddy quota was introduced into a context that was poorly aligned with this new egalitarian policy or policy with strong egalitarian features. The Slovak context was characterized by inegalitarian gender norms, identities, but also patterns of leave division that may significantly moderate the effects of the seemingly best practice policy. To give you a bit more detail, around the time the policy was introduced, the division of leave in Slovakia was shaped by the gendered norm of threeness, which mandates that it is not only right, but natural for children to spend the first 3 years of their lives at home with their mothers. The norm was also mirrored in the prevalent gendered patterns of leave division. So while almost all mothers were taking quite long breaks from paid work following the birth of their child, barely any fathers were taking leave. And Slovaks were also comparatively supportive of this unequal division of labor. In 2012, so the year after the new policy came into effect, 60% of Slovaks thought paid leave should be taken entirely by the mother, even if both parents were in a similar work situation. And this was more than anywhere else in the OECD. Fewer than 10% thought that leave should be split equally by mothers and fathers. Slovaks also ranked among the most inegalitarian in the EU in thinking that men should not mainly look after children and the home, and that fathers must put their careers ahead of looking after their young children. We took these unique features of the case as a starting point, and we first explore how the Slovak leave policy for fathers might be studied by researchers interested in policy transferability, causality, and best practice. And second, we problematize this approach based on feminist theoretical innovations. To do this, we draw on a unique administrative data set of all fathers eligible for the benefits between 2011 and mid-2019. And we also work with some secondary data on fathers' leave taking outside our period of observation. And finally, to aid our interpretation, we also draw on the findings of one of my qualitative papers, in which I analyzed interviews with parents that were focused on their decision-making about fathers' leave taking. I'm next going to turn to our theoretical considerations, connected first to causality and then to the best practice characteristics of policy. So to begin with causality, as I already mentioned when setting the scene for this paper, we thought that the Slovak policy, with its exogenous manner of introduction, might attract the attention of researchers interested in the causal effects of policy. So you might ask, how might a researcher interested in causality study this policy? The apparent exogeneity that I talked about earlier might tempt one to study it as a natural experiment. Experiments or randomized controlled trials are seen as the gold standard among researchers interested in isolating causal effects of policy, and natural experiments or quasi-experimental research design are often considered the next best thing. The logic of a natural experiment is based on an expectation of a quick and stable behavioral change in response to policy reform. If the change is quick and stable, the research design should be able to isolate the causal effect while everything else is held equal, or in other words, before anything else has had time to change since the policy reform. This logic is linked to the idea of policy transferability. If such a causal effect of policy can be isolated in one setting, the implication is that the same policy, if implemented elsewhere, should lead to similar results, irrespective of context. However, if we focused on isolating a causal effect independent of the context, we might risk underplaying the role of context in the setting where the policy was effective in the first place. In other words, underplaying the role of further factors that may have been in place in the original context, but may be absent in others, which makes causal research designs a tricky fit for feminist frameworks like the gender structure. Understanding gender as a structure suggests a more complex relationship between policy and behavior, in which policy is just one of multiple gendering mechanisms forming the gender structure that shapes individual behavior. So along with policy, there are other dimensions in there, other gendering mechanisms that are also affecting the behavior the policy is meant to change. In this framework, this means the effects of policy reform will be moderated by these further mechanisms of the structure, like gender norms or gendered attitudes or identities. And these are, of course, context dependent, which poses a significant challenge to attempt to isolate a causal effect independent of context. But the gender structure is also interconnected and dynamic, or the individual mechanisms of it are interconnected and dynamic, which means two things. First, the policy may also affect change in these further mechanisms of the structure. So, for example, policy may shape individual attitudes or norms, as has been theorized and to a lesser extent also confirmed by empirical research. And second, these changes to other dimensions of the gender structure may in turn further shape the effects of the policy. So if, for example, the policy contributes to change in gendered norms on the division of labor, making the norm, say, more egalitarian, this in turn will shape the effects of the policy. But such dynamic effects may take longer to materialize, which poses an additional challenge to identifying a quick and stable causal effect of policy. So that was a bit on causality, and now our considerations on best practice characteristics. The idea of policy transferability also motivates attempts to identify the best practice characteristics of policy, or as I like to think about it, to strip policies to their bones. Once such characteristics, these key bare bones characteristics of a successful policy are identified, if a policy that ticks these same boxes is implemented in a different setting, it should be similarly successful, right? Especially if a causal effect has been identified. However, we argued that this commitment to parsimony in terms of policy features may result in paying less attention to further characteristics of the policy, which at the same time may significantly moderate the effectiveness of the policy. So what did we find when we looked at our data, and what options for interpretation did we identify? This chart shows the uptake of leave benefits by fathers since 2011, when the policy came into force. You can see that the uptake in the first years after the policy was introduced was negligible. And although this is not shown in the chart, in fact, it was very similar to the number of fathers who had been making use of the low flat rate parental allowance that was in place before the daddy quota was introduced specifically, was not introduced specifically for fathers, as I discussed earlier, but this policy that could be used exclusively by fathers was introduced. So the flat rate parental allowance was not expected to be particularly motivational, unlike the daddy quota that we're analyzing here. But the uptake was very similar in the first years. So drawing on a long tradition of microeconomic policy analysis, we might attempt to exploit the exogeneity of the policy to assess its causal effect. We might treat the reform as a critical juncture and could compare fathers' leave taking just before and after the policy was introduced. And if we ran with the assumption of quick and stable change and focused on the first weeks, months, or even years following the policy reform, we might conclude that the policy was not successful in stimulating fathers' demand for leave taking, all else held equal. In addition, we might suggest that the much larger changes in fathers' behavior that have been observed elsewhere, like Sweden or Norway, which happened practically overnight in these countries. So a huge proportion of fathers basically started using these benefits right away. So we could argue that these larger effects were due to anticipatory behavior or reverse causality. So these reforms were debated in the societies, or were even implemented in response to popular demand. And we could argue that the real causal effects of leave policies for fathers, the real ones, are actually far more modest, as we can see in the Slovak case. In fact, if this were the first policy of its kind globally, or one of the first, we might conclude that daddy quotas are not very successful at all. However, when we draw on the conceptualization of gender as a context-dependent and dynamic structure, an alternative interpretation emerges. We could argue, and in fact, we do, that despite the promising policy reform, fathers' behavior continued to be constrained by additional inegalitarian dimensions of the gender structure, which were misaligned with the egalitarian characteristics of the new policy. And this interpretation was supported by interviews with parents that I carried out for another paper of my thesis. As I already briefly discussed, a structural understanding of gender suggests that policy change may not only allow or motivate individuals to change their behavior, so in this case, motivate fathers to take leave, but a structural understanding of gender also suggests that change in policy may affect change in additional dimensions of the gender structure, including gendered norms or parents' gendered identities. But though this slide shows a noticeable change in fathers' behavior in their uptake of the benefit, my interviews showed barely any change in these further dimensions of the gender structure. Parents spoke of the continuing power of traditional gender norms, as well as their own and their partner's gendered identities. And I pulled out a couple of quotes to illustrate this. Oops. Sorry about that. All but two parents with whom I discussed the issue of norms invoked the persisting norm of threeness, this unwritten rule that children should be at home with their mothers until the children reach the age of 3. Mothers who transgressed against this unwritten rule by returning to work earlier recounted grappling with guilt. This included Ula, who was a plain-spoken researcher and a mother of 2, and who acted on her egalitarian identity and decided to return to paid work before the 3 years were up, irrespective of whether her husband would take leave or not. And though he eventually decided to stay at home, Ula experienced the persisting effect of the norm. She told me, quote, "There's a lot of emotional legwork that you as a woman just have to do when the father takes leave. You were the primary carer and suddenly it's someone else. Plus, the society really gives it to you, right? We've seen the statistics and saw how Slovaks still perceive it, that you're basically damaging your child when you leave before it is 3 years old. Sometimes I definitely feel a kind of guilt." End of quote. So though the norm of threeness clearly did not deter Ula from an earlier return to paid work, and so from allowing or motivating her husband to take leave, other mothers may have been less inclined to diverge from the norm to avoid social sanctioning. In fact, compared to mothers who complied with the norm, Ula may have been simply more conscious of it due to her transgression. The norm of threeness was complemented by the male breadwinner norm that continued constraining fathers' decision-making on whether to take leave. A particularly striking case was that of Patrick, whose wife Paulina was an experienced sales clerk and was perhaps the most determined to quickly return to paid work of all the mothers I spoke to. In fact, Paulina started part-time paid work 3 months after giving birth, which is extremely unusual in the Slovak context, where most mothers really do take very long breaks from work. However, juggling her job and childcare was becoming increasingly difficult. And as Patrick was reluctant to take leave himself, it was more and more likely that Paulina would have to step back from her job. To explain his decision, Patrick distinguished between the law that allowed him to take leave and the norm that was stopping him, even at the expense of his wife's wishes. Patrick told me, quote, "The law says the employer must provide the position back to me, but I'm not sure that would really be the case. I wasn't quite sure. If I left, they would have to replace me, right? The law says one thing, but reality may be somewhere else." End of quote. And of course, this is a norm that applied to Patrick, but was not preventing Paulina from taking her long break from paid work. Similarly, parents. What's happening here? There we go. Similarly, parents in egalitarian gendered identities seemed largely unaffected by the policy and continued constraining fathers' leave taking. This was well illustrated by two parents in my sample, a couple, Hugo and Helena. Hugo was a high-ranking manager in a private corporation who drew on maternity benefits for two of his three children, but took no break from paid work and continued working full-time throughout. So the care of their children fell to his very energetic wife, Helena. Granted, Hugo was one of the few fathers in my sample and a small number of fathers in the population whose income exceeded the benefit cap for the policy, meaning that the family would have experienced a drop in their disposable income had Hugo taken leave. But he also could not picture himself as a full-time carer and suggested that Helena was better suited to staying at home by virtue of being a woman. He said, quote, "If I were her, I would want to get out of that environment for sure. There would be some sort of degradation to my behavior, right? But there are women, people who don't mind it, right? Who can enjoy it." End of quote. At the same time, Helena's view suggested that mothers' gendered identities also help prevent fathers' leave taking. So it wasn't just the men. And sometimes this was at the expense of the mother's own well-being. During the time when Hugo drew on maternity benefits, it was Helena who shouldered primary responsibility for the children while also working part-time in her own retail business. And in the final months before their youngest son started kindergarten, Helena felt completely burned out. She said, quote, "I was already in such a state, I was just going to die." End of quote. But she did not want to ask Hugo to be more involved in childcare. And when explaining her thought process, Helena drew on her gendered identity. Quote, "Because when my husband is at work, I just feel it deep inside me that I must give him the peace because he is the breadwinner. That is just the way it worked out. He helps when necessary, but I just feel that way. I don't know why I feel that way, that I have to unburden him." End of quote. These interviews suggest that those fathers who made use of the policy had already been egalitarian in their identities, as had their partners. These parents were willing to divide leave taking more equally and just waiting for more favorable conditions for fathers' leave taking, which materialized with the policy reform. And the ranks of these fathers were joined by a small number of others whose views and identities turned more egalitarian once the reform made leave taking a more realistic option. But a considerable proportion of both fathers and mothers spoke of the continuing power of the persisting inegalitarian gender structure in the form of their or their partner's gendered identities, as well as the gender norms on leave taking. And in this way, the Slovak context was indeed quite unlike the supportive social context, the supportive social norms across communities and workplaces and households. And here I quote Andrea Doucet and Anne-Sophie Duvander speaking about the Swedish case, so when the Swedish policy was introduced. So that was problematizing attempts to isolate the causal effects of policy. But our understanding of the policy effectiveness, or perhaps more specifically, the limits to that effectiveness, grew even more complex when we looked beyond its best practice characteristics. In the previous chart, we saw that the uptake of benefits by fathers gradually grew. In this chart, we see that a high proportion of fathers made use of the likely unintended paid work while on benefits option mentioned earlier in my presentation. So they stayed in paid work while on daddy quota benefits. The share of fathers working on leave grew until 2018, as you can see, when 45% had some income from employment. In the first half of 2019, the share fell for the first time, yet still remained at 29%. So almost a third of the fathers had some income from employment. And anecdotal evidence suggested that the share of self-employed fathers, as opposed to employed fathers who engage in paid work, was also significant and likely even higher than that of employed fathers. But the available quantitative data did not allow us to investigate fathers' income from self-employment while on benefits. We also know a bit more about the extent to which fathers worked. So of the fathers who continued with employment, more than half, 57%, or 17% of all fathers who made use of the benefits. So these earned no more than half of their previous income. And this suggests that they continued with employment part-time, which got them less than half of their previous income. However, further, 23% of those who had some income from employment, or 7% of all fathers who drew on benefits, earned more than 90% of their earlier income. So this suggests that they continued working pretty much full time, and that likely left them little room for a greater role in looking after their child. So again, if we let ourselves be guided by the policy's best practice characteristics, we might conclude that the policy contributed to a significant shift in the division of leave by men and women, even if a lesser one than in some of the other countries where the changes were much quicker and greater in extent. And in our initial analysis, we were leaning towards such an interpretation. However, this emphasis on parsimony could lead us to overestimate the effects of the policy on the change to the division of leaves if we actually hadn't looked at the effect of the work while on benefits option. To quickly conclude, I expect that you might ask, if your critique says how policy effects should not be studied, what do you have to say about how it should be studied? I see Nadine laughing. So this is a question that we have definitely discussed with Wendy. And for now, our answer to this has been that is for all of us to figure out going forward. We find that identifying the problem, the uneasy fit between gender theory and and methods that attempt to mimic experiments in natural sciences is the starting point. Gender is a key factor shaping policy effectiveness, and structural understanding of gender are more and more accepted throughout different bodies of literature. And this just means that we should ramp up our efforts to study policy effects with methods that reflect this. For me, a quick thought is that mixing methods seems like a way forward that should be further explored, putting more emphasis on qualitative research as a resource that helps interpret quantitative research has definitely helped change my thinking about policy effectiveness. And I will stop there. Thank you for your attention, and I will be looking forward to any questions or comments that you might have.